So here we have section 11, part 1, talking about the evolution of journalism. And so we've talked about kind of like the construction bits and the framing bits of journalism, but what about how journalism has changed over history? In the next two lectures we have, we'll kind of look at this progressive shift that we've seen in journalism and what that means. So we start off with kind of looking at some basic questions. What is journalism to you? And with that, you ask, who is a journalist? So, we've had these old definitions of journalism, and these old kind of concepts of who a journalist is or what job the journalist does. And those have kind of changed over time. Think about it yourself. In the old days, when we thought of a journalist, we thought of someone who would show up at an event and write down facts in his little notebook, and then ask questions, do interviews, and then he or she would go to the office and write up the story and put it in the paper. But the tools have changed now, so that we have cell phones and laptops and everything else, cameras everywhere. And so really a journalist has become a much more, the definition's become looser, right? If you capture a major event on your cell phone and post that event, does that make you a journalist? And that's kind of the question that the industry has been wrestling with lately, is how exactly do we define a journalist? How exactly do we define journalism now? But if we go back kind of to when we first had this kind of professionalism put on journalism. A journalist used to just, in the old days, back in the 1800s, a journalist was really just the guy who operated the town paper. There wasn't really any thought or training or anything like that specified how you could be a good journalist or what it took to be a good journalist. And then we had situations that developed that kind of required some professionalism and some standard code of ethics. And then we start talking about the role of a journalist as someone who's objective, right? Objectivity became this huge issue, making sure that you remove yourself from the story, that a journalist is not the focus of the story, but rather that a journalist stays outside of the story and just gives you the facts. That's what we talk about with objectivity, and this became a huge issue after particularly the 1920s and the Spanish-American War in particular. We had this period where all these things were coming about called yellow journalism, that was labeled yellow journalism. And so kind of the birth of that was you had two men. You had William Randolph Hearst and you had Joseph Pulitzer, who were both newspaper magnates. They both owned a lot of newspapers and were trying to outsell and outcompete the other, right? And so many believe that Citizen Kane, the movie Citizen Kane, is basically based on the life of Hearst. But these guys are trying to compete with one another and outsell one another. And in an effort to do that, the stories kind of became larger and larger and larger, more sensational, and not necessarily very objective. Stories were written to draw readers in. And that kind of culminated in this belief that Hearst, who owned the New York Journal, when tensions were starting to arise in Cuba in the 20s, and you had, at that point, Cuba's a colony of Spain, and you have revolutionaries who are trying to overthrow the Spanish government there. And it kind of coincides with this belief in America at the time that there's no more frontier to discover. There's no more building of empire. And how does America become greater if we can't out-own everyone, right? Own more land, have a bigger empire. And so what you see is that America is not too happy with having Cuba, which is just right off its shore, owned by another country, being so close. And Spain definitely had power at that point. And so Hearst played into all of that anxiety and tension and drummed up all this crisis about Cuba, right? Eventually there was a big powder keg event, kind of, which was the sinking of the USS Maine. And all this drumming up of anxiety that Hearst and Pulitzer had done, it was largely responsible for the United States deciding to get into the war. And I can show you here, if I can pull over some of these images, just from a basic Google search. For example, here's the cover of the New York Journal. The Maine, again, what happened with this warship Maine is that it was in waters near Cuba, and there was an explosion, and the Maine sank. And the Journal was very quick to say, okay, well, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. What the paper was doing was most definitely making it seem as though we had been attacked off the coast of Cuba by Spain. They sunk our warship. There were other explanations, and there have since this event been other explanations to say that it was not an external explosion. In other words, it wasn't that the ship hit a mine out in the sea and blew up. But there's a lot of people who have studied this event and said it was an internal explosion, that something from inside the ship blew up. And a lot of people tend to think that it was something in the cargo hold that may have exploded. And it could have been just a freak accident, that Spain, Cuba was no way involved in why that happened. It was a freak accident that caused the explosion. But Hearst was not going to let that be. Hearst is famous for telling someone that an employee of the Journal, that he sent down to Cuba to cover the tensions. He's famous for telling them this person was down there and was supposed to provide images of the fighting and the revolution and all that. And the person who went down there said, there's really not that much to show you. It's not as aggressive. There's not battles like you're thinking between the revolutionaries and the Spanish government. It's not what we thought. And there is really no revolutionary war happening here in Cuba. To which, kind of famously, Hearst responds back and says, if you give me the pictures, I'll give you a war. Right? And so if we can look around, I can try to find you some other pictures here. Call to Duty. I'm trying to see. There's pictures. A lot of these are not photos, though. They're hand-drawn pictures that are done. Now, this is I think this is the New York World, which was owned by Pulitzer. Let's see what else we can find here as far as the Spanish ships on our coast. Congress declares war crisis is at hand. See what else we can get. There's this famous, yeah, here it is right here. See if I can pull it over. Spaniards search women on American steamers, and it shows these men around this naked woman. And so you had all these things that were going on, drumming up this war. What Senator Proctor saw in Cuba. So you had these events that were happening. And people became scared of how much influence Hearst and Pulitzer actually had in drawing us to war. Now, this sounds, if it sounds antiquated and like, well, certainly that wouldn't happen today, just note to yourself that after 9/11, when we went to war in Iraq, there are a lot of people that said the press was largely responsible for that. If you go back and look at the history of going into that, and I can recall it vividly because I was alive and paying attention to all of this, there was news reports day after day after day about Iraq having yellow cake, which was going to be this radioactive material used to make dirty bombs. All this talk about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, having hearings that were live on television about, what's going on over there. Remember, I mean, the perpetrators of 9/11 were from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And so people got caught up in this fervor, though, and decided that, we had to go to war in Iraq. We had to find Saddam Hussein. And so, it still can happen. People think about the Spanish-American War as one of these wars that we really don't remember too much about, but claim that the press had a lot to do in creating it. And I would argue that the press still today has a lot to do with creating tensions. So, after that, after the scare of yellow journalism, you kind of have this reaction of the country to say we need to get back towards having an objective press, having someone that will tell us just the facts and will not try to sensationalize things. Now, I will say this, you can try to be as objective as possible, but a lot of times that's not something you can attain. There's this old saying that says the map is not the territory. It means that anytime you try to reproduce an event, right? Whenever you're trying to tell a story, you can never tell it quite the same way as if you were there experiencing it. If you think about any kind of natural disasters you've encountered, if you've ever been in the middle of a fire, house fire, apartment fire, some kind of fire that was close to you, there's all that terror and fear that's going on at the time. But you could turn around and read the story of it a few days later, and the story just doesn't capture all of the fear and chaos that something like that creates. If you've ever been in a hurricane or a tornado, you know that the news report of the aftermath is never the same as when the event really happened. But still, there's this goal, this striving after the scare of yellow journalism to attain this objectivity. But there's things that can compromise that, of course. It can be compromised through fabrication or bias. And bias, I mean ignoring important stories or just having an outright political bias. Partial storytelling can compromise objectivity. Lack of context, balance, these things can compromise objectivity. When we talk about fabrication, that's just purely making up facts and sources. And we see journalists do this all the time. Why? Because they've attained some type of almost celebrity status. And there's nowhere to go from that area. We talk about Brian Williams with NBC News making up events in the Middle East that he said he was a part of while covering the war that he was not a part of. He made up those facts. He lied. He lied so that it made him look better. Of course, that kind of fabrication compromises objectivity. Brian Williams will never be another large anchor on NBC again because his credibility has been destroyed. Right now, he has a show on MSNBC that starts at about midnight, 11 o'clock our time, right? Because trying to put him out there now as a credible journalist is a stretch. Sometimes you have bias, which may be a willful distortion on part of a journalist. Certainly, we talk about Fox being biased, MSNBC being biased. And so, are they telling you the facts? Well, perhaps so. Are they distorting those facts to try to prove a political point? Probably, yes. They have their own interests, and they interpret facts and a story. They interpret it with their own lens. Some critics will argue that bias exists not because they're actively trying to do that, to craft a story that fits their goals, but rather that occurs because of financial and commercial pressures. So, for example, I'll give you a case here. Ann Coulter is this kind of political and cultural critic, known for saying some very more conservative things, but very outlandish things. And she frequently gets in trouble with groups because she steps out so far on the ledge when she's telling you things. There's a large number of people who look at Ann Coulter and say she doesn't really believe those things. She's just saying them because they get attention. And when she says something so outrageous or so despicable, people pay attention to her. And that's what we mean by this. This bias exists not as some sort of huge conspiracy, but rather because of financial and commercial pressures. Perhaps Ann Coulter is saying what she's saying because she knows that's the only way to make money and to remain famous. If I was to get a show on MSNBC, they give me a show, I know what my audience is like. I know my audience is going to be largely members of the Democratic Party with liberal progressives. And if I put a show on there where I bash liberal progressives and Democrats for 2 hours a night, I'm not going to get the ratings. And so I change up how I'm interpreting and telling stories because I want ratings to be high so I can make money. Partial storytelling sometimes compromises objectivity. We see this all the time now because it used to be that your deadline was maybe midnight in the newspaper. Your deadline for a 6 p.m. newscast may be, 4:30 in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the event may have been so huge that you weren't able to get all of the facts straight, everything hammered down. So you wait and say, well, we won't run this until the 10 o'clock news. Or we won't run this until tomorrow's edition of the paper. You make a decision to say, we don't have all the facts yet, so we're not going to put it out there. That doesn't exist so much now because of social media and this encouragement to journalists to create content all the time. Publish. Put stuff up out there, okay? Never stop. So, for example, if you'll notice the next time that there's a major school shooting, a big violent event, if you'll pay attention to what's coming out over Twitter or being put up on news sites initially, you'll see that there's going to be, eventually when this story is all said and done, you'll notice that there were a lot of incorrect and false things said. That's because people are trying to put out content as fast as they can. And if they think they've heard an authority or an official say something, they'll print it before they know for sure. Lack of context can compromise objectivity. If you don't give the full background behind a story, if you leave out information that a reader or a viewer needs in order to grasp the totality of that story, if you don't give them that, then they can come to the wrong conclusions about what you've said. Or you could come as a journalist to the wrong conclusion. If you don't know the history of an event and you get up and write a story because something happened yesterday, but you don't know about the 5 years of things that's been happening before that, then you really don't tell the right story. Trying to get my mouse back here, I'm sorry. Hey, there we go. Lack of balance. When you're writing a story, you got to make sure that you tell both sides of a story if there are competing views. If there's a story that's looking at tax increases, okay, for example, right now the city of Starkville is considering the possibility of annexing new land into the city limits. There are people in the county that don't want to be annexed in because their taxes are going to go up. And they've had hearings, public hearings, where these county residents have said, what am I going to get for this tax increase? My taxes are going to go up. What am I going to receive? I've already got running water. I've already got volunteer fire services that'll come out if there's some kind of emergency. The county already has sheriffs. What's the point of becoming part of the city? So if you're a journalist writing that story, you need to make sure that you include both the reasons for annexation and the reasons against annexation. Right? You don't want to just spit out one side of the story. Research has found that 48% of newspaper stories focusing on controversial issues were one-sided. And most of those stories favored an issue, when they were one-sided, favored an issue 3-1. In looking at these articles in this research project, the authors found that only 7% of the stories that they read were completely, totally balanced, which is kind of a scary thing. So, how do we achieve objectivity? Well, one thing that you saw come out of the scare of yellow journalism was a development of standards and ethics. You saw media and journalism organizations start to come into fray. You know, around that time, when yellow journalism was being, people were afraid of the influence of it, you have organizations like the organization that I'm a part of, which is the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Comm. They've recently celebrated more than 100 years of being in existence. Those organizations come about because there was this realization that journalists needed to band together and come up with standards. And so because you come up with these standards and these best practices, what you also see come about are these journalism schools. Schools that branded themselves as journalism schools that had journalism curriculum and could therefore provide sound ethical journalistic training. And so when these organizations and these schools developed, some safeguards were put in place, right? Journalists were trained in certain areas. First of all, present conflicting possibilities. So if you have something like annexation of a city, and you have two sides saying here's what they think is the benefit and here's what they think is the detriment of doing this thing, present both of those. Present both sides to say, here's what people fear, here's what people think will be gained. Back that up with supporting evidence. If you're making a claim in the newspaper that, these residents are afraid that their taxes will go up by a certain amount, as a journalist, you can make a statement there and say, but there is no evidence to support that. In fact, if we look back at the last time we annexed land, here's what happened. Provide that evidence. If you're going to make a claim, that let's say there is an arsonist and they have a suspect, provide evidence as to why that person is a suspect. How do we know that he's a suspect? Why is he a suspect? A judicious use of quotation marks. Don't quote someone out of context. Include everything of what they meant. And then we have this thing called the inverted pyramid, structuring information in an appropriate sequence. Why does that matter? Because whether it's a newspaper or whether it's a newscast, there are space restrictions, right? You can't fill up 2 pages of a newspaper on a story about a fire. You're only going to have a certain limited amount of space to put that story in. Same thing with broadcast news. You're only going to have a certain time period, maybe a minute and 30 seconds to tell that story. And because that's the fact, and the reason that is because you never know if something else is going to happen that day that's going to be an even bigger story that needs more coverage. So when you write your story and tell your story, you start with the most important thing first, the bare bone facts. And then as you write, you go into tinier and tinier and tinier details, so that if something has to be cut, it's the tiny little details, but the main focus of the story is still there. This is a process that we call the inverted pyramid. You write the most important thing first, and then you squeeze down into tiny, tiny, tiny details. And if we have to lop off those details later, the gist of the story is still the same. So for a long time, these kind of practices of objectivity were taught and trained and passed down as new journalists were educated. And it didn't take too long before people started thinking of the news as bland. All the stories read the same. There wasn't any liveliness or intrigue into the stories, right? And so after decades of that being the case, and people starting to wonder, well, what's the difference between one newspaper or another, or one journalist or another, people got kind of tired and dissatisfied with the writing style. And so as things, cultural institutions started changing in the 60s and 70s. You had this counterculture that was developing. We see a lot of these institutions going through a change, and certainly journalism was one of those that also experienced this. You had people that look back at that whole thing where I said the map is not the territory, and they said, look, no matter how you try to become objective, you can't achieve that ultimately. You're always going to influence a story, whether you mean to do it intentionally or unintentionally. As a journalist, as a writer, your upbringing, your cultural history, your heritage, your past experiences in daily life, those influence how you tell stories and write things. And so you had writers that came out of this time period in the 60s and 70s and said, why are we striving for this objectivity so much? The point is to tell the truth, but how you get to the truth, maybe we can all do that differently. Maybe instead of always standing back from a story and being in the third person, maybe we should be in the story also. Maybe we should be part of that, right? It's hard to report on something and not be there. And when you are there, there's all these things that you notice that perhaps need to be injected into the story. And so at this time you get this kind of evolution of journalism into this concept that Tom Wolfe referred to as new journalism. You use literary devices that you would find in fiction and nonfiction writers, but novelists and all these different types of writers, you can use some of their literary devices as long as you convey the story truthfully, or at least in your mind what's truthful. And so you see thick description where you use a lot of flourish language to kind of describe exactly what you are experiencing at the time. The smell, the look, how you're interpreting all these stimuli. Interior monologue, the thoughts that are going through your head as you look at all this stuff. The fears or the wonder that you have when you're inside of an event. And also the dialogue, not just an interview between you, the writer, and a subject, but paying attention to the dialogue among other people involved in this story. What's going on between these people? What are they talking about? And so out of this, you get some key writers, one being Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote in this style of new journalism. He often called it gonzo journalism, and just gonzo because he that was his nickname for himself, gonzo, that he did things differently than anyone else. And so I'd like to just play a little bit of a documentary about who he was and how he wrote and his process.
So if you're thinking about the Cultural Revolution, the upheaval of the late 60s, early 70s, he was not only reporting it, he was part of it.
I am a professional journalist, and I know the difference between a secondhand story and one of aggressive first-hand involvement.
What we were looking for in the Kentucky Derby was actually
that was Hunter
the
S. Thompson in
decadent,
his older
depraved
days. And
face
now they're
of
talking
the
about
Kentucky
a
mint
piece they
julep
wrote in
crowd,
the 70s.
And
Hunter
he
wrote
injected
in the
himself
70s.
very much into his reporting. So the stories
regarding
and he were
the
almost one and the
decadence of the
same.
Kentucky
After a
Derby.
week of wanton excess, the two of us went through it all, got ourselves in such a hell of a state, and looked at ourselves in the mirror and realized there's the decadent face. It was us.
I feel like a prisoner now. Not a prisoner, an embedded journalist.
He ended up talking about us. So he had started to invent a scenario for his own kind of writing.
I think his main energy source was taking what we called journalism and making fiction out of it.
With an hour or so to kill before we had to catch the plane, we spread his drawings out on the table and pondered them for a while, wondering if he'd caught the proper spirit of the thing. but we couldn't make up our minds.
The truth in what Hunter wrote is in equal balance with the imagination.
His hands were shaking so badly that he had trouble holding the paper, and my vision was so blurred that I could barely see what he'd drawn. "Shit," he said. "We both look worse than anything you've drawn here."
Where fact ends and where imagination takes over, you know, we never know.
We came down here to see this terrible scene. People all pissed and out of their minds and vomiting on themselves and all that. And now, you know what? It's us.
Well, all right. So much for that. Good.
People ask, did he write fiction? Is it fiction or is it journalism? You know, there's this big blur that he occupied and even seemed to map.
I don't know if there's anybody who was a bigger influence on the way artists and thinkers and journalists saw the world.
He'll tell you the truth, but he's going to tell it to you in his own way. And because he is bodily so present in the story, you know, as a human being, enough to trust his voice, but also distrust and be skeptical at the same time.
Madness. It made no sense at all. I desperately needed the facts.
And he thought, why should I write about something that's sort of less than what I could write about if I don't include myself as this sort of big potato in the stew? You know, I like to say that. You know, there's like a giant potato in the stew, and the giant potato in Hunter's stew was himself.
The important thing was that there was no story until he got involved in it. He really wasn't interested in the actual nuts and bolts of a story unless he was a part of the story.
It's sad. But what's really sad is it never got weird enough for me.
He provoked a situation in order to get a reaction. And once he got a reaction, he knew where he was.
I moved to the country when the boat got too crowded. Then I learned that President Nixon had been eaten by white cannibals on an island near Tijuana. For no good reason at all.
What he was an exhibitionist and a man of enormous syntactical resources.
Most people can't handle the action on whatever they choose or have to call their own turf. And the few who can usually have better sense than to push their luck any further. That was always the difference between Muhammad Ali and the rest of us. He came, he saw, and if he didn't entirely conquer, he came as close as anybody we are likely to see in the lifetime of this doomed generation. Nice piece.
I think he was kind of a beacon for dissent, you know, throughout his whole life. He was a place people could turn to get a moral argument from a immoral outlaw.
I was a good criminal at one point, and probably still am in some ways.
I said he was a fascinating sociological phenomenon, in part because of his capacity to attract so considerable a following.
Obviously, one of the things I have to appreciate about America, and I'd be stupid or insane, is that for good or ill, I can function here.
He was an old-fashioned anarchist. He did not believe in institutions, did not believe in, and that meant he didn't believe in even the institutions of the counterculture.
I don't think that there are many societies or social political systems where I could function the way I am now. And perhaps a lot of people would think it's much better. You know, that's the best argument for destroying the system, that it gets rid of people like me.
He had a sense of drama. His exaggerations, his hyperbole, his utterly unbelievable itinerary. So in that sense, he expedited people who were looking for dramatic potential.
No one categorization covers this new form unless it's Hunter Thompson's own word, gonzo. If so, in the 19th century, Mark Twain was the king of all the gonzo writers. In the 20th century, it was Hunter Thompson, whom I would nominate as this century's greatest comic writer in the English language.
George McGovern and Hunter, are linked throughout history by Hunter's, not only his work, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, but their friendship over the years.
He was always interested in the concept of evil and wickedness, and he frequently saw it in high places that other people had learned to live with.
Richard Nixon represents the dark side of the American dream. Richard Nixon stands to me for everything that I would not want to have happen to myself or be around. He stands for everything that I not only have contempt for, but dislike and think should be stomped out.
For years, I've regarded Nixon's very existence as a monument to all the rancid genes and broken chromosomes that corrupt the possibilities of the American dream. He was a foul caricature of himself, a man with no soul, no inner convictions, with the integrity of a hyena and the style of a poisoned toad.
Tonight, I again proudly accept that nomination for President of the United States.
I couldn't imagine him laughing at anything except maybe a paraplegic who wanted to vote Democratic but couldn't quite reach the lever on the voting machine.
But I have news for you. This time there's a difference. This time we're going to win.
That's as mean as you can get.
So you see the style of Hunter S. Thompson, and he had a deep-seated hatred for Richard Nixon. Hunter S. Thompson wrote a lot for the Rolling Stone. And when Nixon eventually passed away, they chose Hunter S. Thompson to write the obituary. And it's one of the most disrespectful, condescending, hateful obituaries you will ever read. But that he put himself in all the stories. And you saw Bill Murray there. You saw Johnny Depp. The two of them have both played Hunter S. Thompson in movies that were made about him. And John Cusack, the actor, was there. He was a good friend of Hunter S. Thompson. And so Thompson has passed away. But a very lively character. If you do a Google search or look on YouTube for other pieces about Hunter S. Thompson, he was quite a character. So that's going to wrap up. This is our last slide. The next lecture that we have, we'll look at other forms of journalism that evolved throughout the years, and so we'll take a look at where journalism has been and where it's heading. But that will conclude the lecture for today. Thanks, and see you in class.